It's the 31st episode of the WWJ Industry Connected Podcast, a monthly podcast devoted to the groundwater industry produced by the National Groundwater Association. I'm your host, Mike Price, and today we're joined by Danny Kingham, PG of GSI Environmental Inc. We discuss key issues and challenges of sustainable data center siting and operations, use of geothermal systems to power and cool data centers, what geothermal contractors need to know when bidding on these projects, and more. We welcome to the podcast Danny Kingham, PG, Principal Hydrogeologist for GSI Environmental Inc. in Houston, Texas, who volunteers on NGWA's Data Center Task Force. We're having her on to discuss sustainable data center siting and operations. Welcome to the podcast, Danny.
Thank you, Mike.
Before we begin, can you please share your career background with us?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I went to school in Texas, so I'm a native Texan. Upon graduation from graduate school, I immediately joined GSI Environmental. We're an environmental consulting firm headquartered in Houston. And so I joined GSI back in 2005. I've been with them ever since, so over 20 years. The first half of my career really focused on field investigations, so traditional site investigation work, and then eventually pivoted to environmental litigation. And in recent years, I have helped our company build out new service areas. So we specialize in Class 6 as carbon dioxide injection well permitting and compliance. We also specialize in critical mineral development, geothermal network system design, and here recently, data center development and applications of some of these tools and services to help make data centers more sustainable.
Excellent. Well, we're glad to have you on, and thank you for serving on the task force as a volunteer. Let's jump into your focuses on sustainable data center siting and operations. In your experience here thus far, what are the key issues and challenges you've encountered to date?
Well, data centers in some ways they're similar to other large scale facilities. So they face many of the same challenges that any large scale facility does. But what's interesting about data centers is that the scale at which they need power and water. And so the biggest challenges that I hear about, whether it's from clients or going to technical and regulatory conferences, it's access to power, and then the close second would be access to water. The more traditional environmental issues, like for example, understanding the presence of wetlands and jurisdictional waters, an increase in permeable surface. So what kind of effect will the data center have on local stormwater control? There's also potential air emissions, especially if the data center is going to have a co-located natural gas power plant. So then there are air permitting concerns or challenges, and then also potential impacts to groundwater availability, groundwater quality. These data centers will produce some amount of waste. The waste can be liquid waste, solid waste, e-waste. And so how are you going to manage the waste coming from them? Land use considerations, community concerns, lots of different challenges that, again, you might see at other large-scale facilities, but data centers, they're very complex. They have a multitude of really multidisciplinary environmental and infrastructure challenges. So I would say for me, sustainable data center siting really starts at the beginning, asking the right questions so that you can better address or better mitigate those challenges. So asking yourself, do we have enough water? Do we have reliable power? Is the geology and the hydrogeology suitable? Can you obtain the necessary permits? Can the facility operate sustainably for decades? Can you expand the facility if you want in the future? So it's a multidisciplinary, complex problem that requires early early consideration, early assessment to help mitigate those challenges. Depending on the size of the data center, its location in proximity to, say, cities, neighborhoods, sensitive properties, it depends on whether the facility is going to build their own natural gas power plant, for example, so that they could provide their own energy. All of these are different factors that can affect the overall timeline, particularly because of the various regulatory requirements. And some of the permits have long lead times. So depending on the design of the facility, the type of cooling technology, how they're going to get their power, how let's say how many tenants they're going to have, and all of these are different things that affect the overall time frame for the facility from the initial site selection to the design to the construction to then operation. And so you're looking at least a couple of years to get everything established before you can turn it on.
Well, thank you for sharing that information. And in your experience working on data centers, what are the main geological considerations for siting and operations of them?
I think sometimes geology might be thought about a little bit later in the facility, the site selection, and I'm here to say start as early as possible. Geology, hydrogeology, very important in understanding how the future operations can proceed from a sustainable perspective, and then also understanding what other tools can you pull from your toolkit to help reduce, say, water usage or reduce air emissions. And so, from a geological standpoint, I think there are several things that need to be considered very, very early. So first is groundwater. I mentioned earlier that groundwater is the number two, probably mission critical component to safely or to operate a data center sustainably. So if groundwater is going to be part of the water supply for a data center, especially if it's going to be the sole water supply, we need to understand the local groundwater resources. And that means understanding how productive the aquifers are, how much water is actually available, how many water supply wells the data center can put in, whether pumping could affect neighboring users or other groundwater resources. Now, second, the subsurface geology itself is important in understanding how to design just the facility foundations, any underground infrastructure, stormwater infiltration, and then if you were to add on geothermal, whether it's shallow geothermal or deep geothermal, it's critical that you understand the geology very early on. It's not about whether there are it's not so much that there are existing resources, it's about how will those resources perform or provide over the full lifespan of the data center. And especially if there are any plans to expand that data center in the future, then you need to make sure that you consider all of these things. And that's first looking at the geology and hydrogeology early on.
You mentioned shallow geothermal, deep geothermal. Excited to hear what are the benefits you're seeing of using geothermal systems to power and cool data centers?
That's a great question. We hear a lot about deep geothermal as a reliable source for firm baseload power. There are many locations throughout the U.S. where we have deep, hot geothermal waters that can provide power as a source of energy. And so when I go to technical conferences, I see a lot about deep geothermal. Now, there is a challenge there. You can't do deep geothermal just anywhere, but it's something that if the conditions are right, it's an excellent source of a reliable, firm baseload power. What I want to expand on, though, is shallow geothermal. So shallow geothermal poses a really interesting opportunity for data centers particularly because cooling is such a major part of the energy and water equation at these facilities. So, when I talk about shallow geothermal, I'm generally talking about using the subsurface as a heat sink, or in some situations, even a heat source. A lot of people don't know this, but the shallow subsurface, less than 500 feet, has pretty stable temperatures across the US, and the temperatures can range between 50 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can take heat from the data centers, put it into the ground, rather than, say, relying on conventional evaporative cooling systems or other cooling technologies that may be cost prohibitive or actually require more energy to operate. So, one of the biggest potential benefits then is just decrease in water usage. So just to put that in perspective, traditional evaporative cooling towers, they can consume a significant amount of water. For example, they can, let's see, through the evaporative cooling process, you can lose about 70% of the water that you're sending through. And a typical mid-size data center, let's say around 50 megawatts, if you have an evaporative cooling tower, it can consume around over 300,000 gallons per day, which is equivalent to about 1,000 households. Whereas on the flip side, if you use what's called closed loop geothermal systems, that can dramatically reduce the water demand. There can also be energy efficiency benefits because you're taking advantage of the relatively constant temperatures underground rather than trying to reject heat directly to the air. But again, even just like for deep geothermal, shallow geothermal isn't automatically the right answer for every data center. You have to have the right geology, you have to have available land area, you have to consider the thermal properties of the subsurface, the aquifer conditions, and the data center specs. So the size, the thermal load of the facility, all of that matters. So I see it that whether it's deep geothermal or shallow geothermal, these are other tools in the toolbox. But again, it's about the geology and the hydrogeology, and you've got to look at that early on. I would say ideally before you select your site.
Got it. That makes sense. So in light of this growth of data centers, um, what do geothermal contractors need to know before bidding on a data center cooling project? And once they have bid on a project, what are the typical next steps for them to know?
Yes, I would say my advice is understand the subsurface before you bid the project. And a lot of these geothermal contractors, they understand this. They understand that there are three main factors that you need to look at: the subsurface, the data center itself, what the heat load's going to be, operational timeline, any expansion plans. But the third would be the land surface, surface access. These geothermal network systems, these closed loop systems, they could require pretty significant footprints. And so understanding what the available footprint looks like, that's important. So they need to understand what the formations are going to be that they're drilling through, the expected depth to groundwater, thermal properties of the formations over time, whether there are any geologic or environmental constraints that could affect construction. There are different types of groundwater and heat transport modeling that can be conducted. In terms of the data center itself, it's not just the thermal load, but also what are the peak and average cooling demands? How does that vary seasonally and over the full life of the project? And again, if the facility wants to expand. And so those questions, they determine the size and the configuration of the geothermal system. The last thing you want to do is design a system where your geothermal wells are competing with each other and you lose efficiency over time. So I would say a contractor, before they bid, understand the data center, the subsurface, and the physical space, that footprint that's available for the geothermal field.
Yeah, in regards to geothermal boreholes not competing with one another over the lifespan of a data center, can you elaborate more on on what you mean there?
Yeah, certainly. So when you're offloading heat to the subsurface, the idea is that you want that heat to dissipate away from your geothermal system, and so that you can keep offloading heat to the subsurface over time. So if you don't design your system effectively, then the geothermal wells will start to compete with each other, meaning that you'll start to heat up the aquifer so much that you can't offload as much heat into that aquifer. Now, some people want to hold on to that heat. It's called aquifer thermal storage. They can access that heat later on for either energy generation or for heating buildings. But I foresee, at least initially, many of the data centers that are going to turn to shallow geothermal as a cooling means, they're going to want that heat to dissipate. And so understanding the subsurface, conducting some robust groundwater and heat transport modeling, understanding the spacing of your geothermal wells and the overall design of that network is going to be critical so that you can have efficient geothermal operations over the full life of the data center facility.
And do you see the modeling of the subsurface thermal capabilities, the findings of those coming out in the next, I don't know, years soon?
There may, you know, this is probably one of the biggest challenges in our field is people hold on to their data and their results. And so I think we'll see more and more maybe research institutions, you can look to peer-reviewed technical literature to see the effectiveness of heat transport in different aquifer systems. Otherwise, it's going to really be site specific and project specific, and so the results will likely, be a proprietary information that are owned by that geothermal system operator or that data center facility. So I would love it if everybody put their findings out there, but it's just not the way it is. Yeah, so it's interesting. Geothermal's been around for a really long time and it's a proven technology, but we don't see widespread application of it across the US. But I can say here in Texas, where we have the most planned data center facilities in any other state, we're actually seeing geothermal starting to really take off. And at this time, we have about just shy of 6,000 shallow geothermal wells that are permitting or are permitted to be constructed. And even deep geothermal for energy production, we have at least two deep geothermal wells permitted. The permitting comes from the Texas Railroad Commission. They have jurisdiction over geothermal wells. The Railroad Commission just finalized some rules on shallow geothermal just last year. And so since then, we've seen more and more get permitted and online and supporting large scale development like whole neighborhoods. And whole, large scale communities. And so it's really exciting, even though geothermal's been around for a while, it's kind of at the beginning, or it's in its infancy stage in terms of widespread application in states where we haven't really seen it in the past.
Great. Well, as we wrap up this episode, how do you see integrating the use of alternative sources of water, such as reclaimed wastewater or treated produced water, for the cooling needs of a data center?
So data centers are getting very creative, thinking outside the box in terms of where they're going to get their water from. So it's really cool to work with data centers that are open to considering alternative sources, and there are already some that are looking to reclaimed wastewater from potable wastewater treatment plants. And so I think, alternative water sources are going to become increasingly important as data centers continue to grow, particularly in water stressed areas. Reclaim municipal wastewater is probably the most immediate opportunity. instead of using, say, for example, high quality potable water for cooling, you can use treated wastewater. The only problem there is that in some cases, you may not be able to get enough water from the wastewater treatment plant. So I don't foresee for the hyperscale facilities, the larger facilities, looking to reclaim wastewater as their predominant source of water, but it could be a great supplemental resource. Now, you mentioned produced water and the treatment of produced water. This is also very exciting. There is a lot of buzz about the beneficial reuse of produced water for a multitude of things like agriculture, industrial process water, even surface water recharge, but also data centers. And so the challenge there is produced water is because it's coming from an oil and gas reservoir, it's going to have varying water quality concerns. It could have a really high salinity. And so these potential contaminants and water high salinity concerns can pose a big issue for use at data centers. So the produced water would need to be treated to a certain water quality composition that would work for whatever cooling technology that you're using at your data center. And so, from my perspective, the important thing is to think about water as the overall data center design, rather than treating water supply as an afterthought, and do consider, well, hey, where is this data center located? And can we think outside the box? Can we get creative on the various, on how you can get that water supply?
Well, this has been enlightening. Thank you for sharing your expertise in this area, Danny. The Data Center Task Force of NGWA is working on a white paper. I wanted to mention that to viewers. We have a position paper already, and now the Data Center Task Force is working on a white paper. There's a webinar, Data Centers and Groundwater, what NGWA members need to know, on September 17th. And there's a Data Centers, Groundwater, and Sustainable Water Management Forum on December 7th, before Groundwater Week 2026 in Las Vegas. So the day before Groundwater Week, there's that forum. So you can check ngwa.org/events for more information. And Danny, thank you so much for your time and expertise in sharing with us today.
No problem. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for watching and listening to the WWJ Industry Connected Podcast. We'll be back next month with a brand new episode, so be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. We're on all the major platforms, so it'll be easy to find us. And visit waterwelljournal.com for the latest expert columns, feature articles, videos, and news covering the groundwater industry. So one more time for Danny and I, thank you for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time.